So, welcome to our event tonight about financing of development cooperation after COVID-19. My name is Rasmus Andresen. I'm a member of the European Parliament for the Greens, and I have organized this event tonight. In these days or weeks are quite crucial for the development in the European Union, but also for the whole world. We are negotiating and debating recovery measures as response on the COVID-19 crisis, and at least there is also a risk that inequality among countries and people living in different countries will raise, because some of the richer states in the world have maybe more possibilities to react on the COVID-19 crisis. But on the other side, we can also see that the COVID crisis shows that we are all in this together, and that we are in a global society where the COVID virus or coronavirus doesn't stop at any border, and this is why we need to discuss that globally and to discuss the development of the world here in the European Union. The European Union and the member states in the European Union are the biggest contributors for human aid and global assistance, and this means for us Greens that we have a lot of responsibility, or high responsibility, for global development, and that we really need also to go further with the financing of development cooperation. The European Union, but also the states had set the goal of spending a target of 0.7% of the GNI for development related spending, and just few states had reached that goal. The European Union at least, and most of the states are spending and much less money than the 0.7% of the GNI. The target for the EU now is 0.46%, and we think we need to fulfill the goals we've set, and that means that we need to look on the development financing instruments. And as many of you know, now we are negotiating and debating the long-term budget in the European Union, and the Commission had proposed some different instruments also for development financing. They had proposed to raise some of the programs in their latest proposal some week ago, but if that is enough to fulfill our goals and to get a push for human aid and development financing, and what the quality of these instruments is, that is what we should discuss tonight. And that's why I am really happy to welcome two experts on these kind of questions. First of all, Katrin Behrensmann, you are a senior research fellow, and you had been project leader on many projects on development financing, and you are working for the German Development Institute in Bonn. Welcome to you. And with us is Maxi Köhler. You are one of the youth ambassadors of the One campaign, campaigning against extreme poverty in the world and for human aid. And you will get the possibility to tell us a little bit more also about the One campaign and what your goals are. We've met in the campaign, in my campaign for the European elections last year, where you also were campaigning and you tried to get some candidates to support your goal. And one of the reasons why we are discussing that here is because you and your colleagues had asked me what I will do if I would be elected to the European Parliament. And now, 1 year later, we are meeting again and we are discussing these kind of questions. Before Katrin Behrensmann will take the floor to give us an input on the questions I've raised, I would like to say two organizatorial things. First of all, in German, für alle, die eine Übersetzung brauchen von Deutsch zu Englisch gibt es die Möglichkeit, über die Chat-Funktion auf einen Link zuzugreifen. Wenn man den anklickt, dann bekommt man Zugang zu einer schriftlichen Übersetzung für alle diejenigen, denen es sonst etwas schwerfällt, auf Englisch der Diskussion zu folgen. And the second thing I would like to add is that if you would like to come with remarks, to take the floor, then you can use the raise the hand function in the webinar tool, so that you can get the floor, and after I would have said your name, then you can then I will give you the word, and you can ask your questions or come with remarks in this discussion later on. We are happy to get a lot of requests from you, because we want to discuss that with all of you and not just by us three. And if you don't want to take the floor, but you have a question or a remark, then you can use the question function also in the webinar tool, and then you can write your question or your remark, and then we will include it in the debate afterwards. But let's look on that later. Now I'm really happy, Katrin, to listen to your input on the questions I've raised and to the situation for financing development cooperation. Please.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me for this webinar, and I'm happy to give a presentation mainly on the debt problems in developing countries, and the Corona crisis and the debt problems in developing countries, and on a potential Marshall Plan for developing countries. I will start with the debt crisis, how to avoid and resolve the debt crisis in developing countries in the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis. I will first give an overview on the current debt situation in low-income countries. Second, I will provide a short-term solution. And third, I will provide some long-term solutions to the debt problems in developing countries. Currently, or even before the crisis, about half of low-income countries were already highly indebted. The main reasons for this were the change in the composition of debt from concessional to market-based loans, mainly from private and public creditors. These public creditors include mainly non-Paris Club donors such as China or India. In addition, the public debt increased. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, the public debt in percent of the country's GDP rose on average, or it was on average between 2010 and 2016 about 33%, and it increased to more than 50% according to the IMF. However, the heavily indebted countries are obliged to use their scarce financial resources to service their debt. And so they don't have enough resources which would have been needed for education, health, or social security systems. The COVID-19 pandemic will further deteriorate the debt situation in developing countries. First, the public revenues will decline. According to estimates of the World Bank, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, in 2020, the revenues will be about 20% lower compared to the situation without the crisis. In addition, accordingly, the fiscal situation will deteriorate. And again, if we take the sub-Saharan Africa as an example, in 2020, the budget deficit in percent of GDP will be about 2.7% higher compared to the situation without the crisis, according to the World Bank again. moreover, export earnings in developing countries will decrease substantially. So there will be a deep recession in many developing countries, and the World Bank estimated that there will be a decline of growth in sub-Saharan Africa, which will be between -2.5 and -5% in 2020. This is the first recession in over 25 years. So, and this is due or mainly due to the impact of the pandemic. So there is a really serious situation in developing countries, and particularly probably in low-income countries, and most of the low-income countries are in sub-Saharan Africa. So what we need would be really short-term liquidity for low-income countries, because developing countries will not be able to cope with the crisis on their own. The international community has a shared responsibility. The international financial institutions, the IFIs, have or are ready to provide extensive financial resources, but these are still not sufficient, according to my view. The World Bank, for example, will provide over the next 15 months about $160 billion and the IMF about $50 billion for developing countries. But the countries still lack liquidity, and these loans provided by the international financial institutions will, in addition, increase their debt. So an immediate liquidity support is needed, and there could be, for example, a debt moratorium, a debt relief on debt service, or a more comprehensive debt relief to highly indebted low-income countries. The Paris Club members and the G20 have recently, in April, agreed to suspend their debt service payments for the poorest countries from May to December 2020. The main aim was to improve the debtors' liquidity position. However, this is not enough again. If we look, for example, at sub-Saharan Africa, the African finance ministers and the World Bank have estimated that this region would need about 100 billion immediately. If we look at all interest payments to multilateral, bilateral, and private creditors for 2020, this would be 44 billion. So a suspension of debt service payments would provide immediate fiscal space for these countries, but this is unfortunately not sufficient. In addition, the IMF has provided through a special instruments, a so-called catastrophe containment and relief trust, interest or debt service waiver. But this is also, according to my view, not enough. What we would really need would be a comprehensive debt relief to highly indebted low-income countries. But if we would provide a debt relief, it would be important to have equal treatment of all creditors. That is, all public and private creditors should participate equally in the debt relief. Otherwise, we would have a free rider problem among creditors. It would also be important to have more transparency on debt contracts. All public creditors and public debtors should therefore disclose their loan agreements. Otherwise, it would be difficult to evaluate the debt situation. There should be a case-by-case analysis of the single low-income countries. Eligible countries should be highly indebted already. And this could be done by the debt sustainability analysis of the World Bank and IMF. Clearly, we have here the problem that World Bank and IMF are also creditors, and they would assume two roles. But nevertheless, those institutions have most of the data available, and they are already conducting debt sustainability analysis. And debt relief should be tied to economic reforms in order to prevent a renewed debt crisis in developing countries. These were short-term solutions, but in the long term, of course, to prevent a looming debt crisis in LICs, according to my view, mainly two instruments, but of course there are also others, but I would focus on two instruments, are important. These are guidelines for responsible lending and borrowing, and there are already several guidelines, for example, the G20 operational guidelines for sustainable finance, but we also have principles provided by the UN for responsible lending and borrowing. Here, it would be important that the international community should agree on uniform principles for responsible lending and borrowing, and that debtors and creditors would adhere to them. In addition, we have seen one of the main reasons for the highly indebtedness was a bad debt management. And here, again, good debt management would be a very important instrument. So this was my view to the debt crisis or looming debt crisis in developing countries. And I will, in a second presentation, I will stick to the question whether a Marshall Plan for developing countries would be needed. First, I will give an overview of the Marshall Plan for Europe, which we had after the Second World War. Second, I will explain the different circumstances in Europe and developing countries. Third, I will outline the similarities in Europe and in developing countries. And fourth, I will provide a proposal for a Marshall Plan for developing countries in the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis. The Marshall Plan is often regarded as the most important or large-scale foreign aid program we ever had. The elements were the following. It durated 4 years from 1948 to 1951. The recipients were European countries. The volume of aid was about 13 billion US dollar, or about 2% of European GDP. The aid was linked to conditions similar to those of modern, or similar to those structural adjustment loans. For example, low fiscal deficits, stabilized exchange rates, or the removal of distortional price controls, or others. The objectives of the Marshall Plan were economic as well as political. The economic objectives were first to contribute to economic growth and to prevent the collapse of the economic activity in Europe. Second, to repair infrastructure and the housing stock. Third, to rebuild war-torn regions. Fourth, to remove trade barriers. Fifth, to modernize industry. And sixth, to build up a market for American exports. But there were also political objectives. For example, to prevent social unrest, to support and reconstruct the market economy, including economic liberalization, and to prevent the spread of communism. And to promote economic and political integration of Europe. The result was a strong economic recovery and also a contribution to European integration. For example, the Marshall Plan supported trade and financial integration. For example, the Marshall Plan supported the European Payments Union with 500 million US dollars. And a further result was that America had a strong influence in Europe. But what are the differences between Europe and the developing countries? The European countries were already highly developed. They had a quite developed industry, economic structure, the education of people was quite well, and also the administration worked quite well. They had property rights and the rules of law were well established. So Europe might also have been able to growing on its own. It's not clear whether they really would have needed the Marshall Plan. In developing countries, the economic structures are not well developed, and foremost, they are concentrated on few raw materials and products, at least in many developing countries. The social and health systems in developing countries are worse than they were in Europe. And in addition, there are different global circumstances. In particular, we have now environmental problems and an ecological crisis as well, which we didn't have directly after the Second World War in this, so much. The similarities of Europe and the developing countries are that they are both in need, or were both in need, of immediate financial resources, including a low flexibility of fiscal policies, at least in many countries. Many countries are or were highly indebted, and many countries are and were in need of infrastructure financing. So there are some differences between Europe and developing the situation of Europe and developing countries. Nevertheless, there are also similarities. According to my view, if we would establish a Marshall Plan, it would be important to provide immediate liquidity support, and this responsibility should be carried by the international financial institutions, not only IMF and World Bank, but also other multilateral banks and industrialized countries. There should be a debt relief. It would really be necessary to have currently a debt relief, although of course a debt relief is also, there are also some disadvantages of a debt relief. It would be important to support the social and health systems in developing countries, for example, by earmarking financial support for these sectors. It would be important to provide an economic stimulus for developing countries in the aftermath of the corona pandemic. And due to the fact that we also have an ecological crisis, we would need some kind of green Marshall Plan. We would need to invest in greening the industry and in greening infrastructure. And it would be necessary to offer financial resources to developing countries for climate mitigation and adaptation. Thank you. Thank you for, Okay.
Now it works. I had problems with the microphone, so I'm sorry. Thanks, Katrin, for your first input. As I said before, if you have questions or if you would like to contribute with your opinion and your perspective to the discussion, then please do so in the with the question function in the tool, or with raising your hand so that I can give you the floor. But first, I would like to welcome Maxi Küller. Maxi, I already mentioned that you are an activist and one of the ambassadors for the One campaign, and I'm really appreciating that you are participating and will contribute with your perspective. And maybe you can start also telling us a little bit about the One campaign and the work you are doing.
Yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity and all the things you do for raising awareness for this really important topic. As you already said, I'm a youth ambassador for the One campaign, which is a global movement we're campaigning to end extreme poverty and preventable disease by 2030. And our movement started in the United States, but now we are in many different countries, also in 4 countries in Africa, which I'm really happy about. And we believe that the fight against poverty is not about charity, but about justice and equality. And with our work, we pressure governments to do more to fight extreme poverty and preventable disease, as I already said. And we empower citizens to hold their governments to account, for example, with petitions or with mails and stuff like that. And we have a lot of different campaigns. Rasmus already mentioned the One Vote campaign, which was last year for the EU elections. And we also have other campaigns like Poverty is Sexist, or our current campaign, the One World campaign, which raises awareness for the big topic, like we're all in this together, and the whole COVID-19 pandemic is something that tackles us all over the world. But not just that, also extreme poverty tackles us all around the world, and everyone has the responsibility to do something. And when it comes to the MFF, we are really focused on heading 6. So this is neighborhood and world. And for 2 years now, we are, have been calling member states to guarantee an EU aid budget of at least 140 billion for heading 6 over the next 7 years. And the new Commission's proposal calls for 132.6 billion, which is a huge step in the right direction, but still not enough. And we think that the next MFF is an opportunity to deliver on European citizens' demand of the EU to address the greatest challenges of our generation, such as tackling extreme poverty and climate change, as you may know. And more than ever, the world needs the EU strategic outlook, its commitment to multilateralism, and strive for equality. And a strong MFF is the key to ensuring the EU delivers most impact. We think that African countries really need an urgent stimulus to develop broad social safety net, access to healthcare, and a basic income to protect the most vulnerable, especially those in the informal economy. African countries need financial support, and the EU can help in many ways. One option is debt sustainability and debt relief, as Ms. Berensman already said. Another option is reducing the costs of remittances to African countries. And another way the EU can support this is through a strong MFF. And the thing is that the rate of global poverty reduction is slowing, and hundreds of millions of people are at risk of being left behind. So if the current trends continue, by 2030 we will have failed to end extreme poverty, with more than 400 million people still having less than $1.90 a day. And the extreme poverty will rise this year by about 40 to 60 million people compared to the original 2020 forecast. So 2020 will be the first year, the first time this century that the number of poor people will rise. And that's for us the reason why the MFF must be a turning point. And for that, in order to the next MFF to succeed, it needs to have a strong heading 6. The latest European proposal, as I already said, is a strong start. And and the member states should support this increase to development aid. But not only the number is important, but the quality of this development aid. And we think that it is important that the next MFF will prioritize health and human development in order to achieve the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And to fix this, the new development instrument should include a legally binding target that 20% of official development assistance must be spent on human development. We think that an increased budget for external policies will ensure that the EU is equipped to achieve its existing priorities, with also responding to the urgent need to build the necessary foundations for resilient and healthy societies. We see that the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on economies and societies demonstrate the need for the EU to redefine its role as a geopolitical actor and put its forth an ambitious vision for the future defined by equality, safety, and the right to health for everyone. We think that an outward-facing Europe that partners with its neighbors and its is an opportunity for more jobs, for economic development, for stability and security. And what we need is a big, bold, ambitious move to develop Africa's potential to the benefit of Europe and Africa. We need a strong partnership between Europe and Africa, not because Africa has a very young population and Europe suffers from an aging population, and investments through the MFF in health, education, agriculture, gender, and the digital economy are vital for Africa in order to have a more competitive economy. And this ultimately leads to the topic of migration and mobility, and education and knowledge and skills transfer. So again, thank you very much, Rasmus, for all the things you're doing and raising awareness for this topic.
Thanks, Maxi. Before we are jumping into the more concrete questions, we already received some, but please still continue with or contribute through the tool here in the webinar tool with the question function, or with raising your hand. I would like to ask the first question on your impression of fighting for development financing these days. Is your impression now, you said, Maxi, that it is going in the right direction because the Commission, the new proposal of the Commission 2 weeks ago, raised some of the figures in some of the programs? Is your feeling, and the same question goes to Katrin Behrensmann as well, that there is an awareness for fighting for the development cooperation and take global responsibility, both on European level when it comes to the European Parliament, to the Commission, but also related to the member states? Maxi, maybe you would like to start also from the campaign work you are doing, and then Katrin, you can answer the question afterwards.
So when it comes to the EU institutions, we had a lot of success with the members of the European Parliament. There are a lot of members that are helping us and that are they are fighting for the same things. They signed our pledge, like you, Rasmus, and I really hope that there's more awareness. I think it's a step in the right direction that the EU Commission increased the heading 6, but I think there's still a lot to do. But on the other hand, Ursula von der Leyen's Green New Deal is also a step in the right direction, which shows at least that there's awareness when it comes to ecological things. And yeah. Yeah, so, and also from our campaigning work, we had some meetings with youth ambassadors from France and from Italy, and also when we were in Brussels, I had the feeling that there are a lot of politicians that think more globally and really are aware of the fact that we in the European Union have to take responsibility. Yeah.
Katrin, do you have the same feeling, or do you think we need to speed up in the political discussion, and politicians are too concentrated on making their own countries work?
Well, no, I also think that many European countries have taken over responsibility for developing countries by, as I said, by providing, for example, the debt relief or the debt relief on services among the Paris Club members. And in addition, a number of European countries are ready to finance trust funds of international financial institutions such as the IMF or World Bank. In addition, I must say, for example, the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, Mr. Müller, he also supports debt relief for developing countries, for low-income countries. So on the member states level, I think they really intend to support developing countries in this difficult situation.
Thanks. The big question in Germany is if the government is following what the minister is saying on these kind of questions, but I can see that we already got a question on that, so I will receive this for later. Now I can see that two people had raised their hands, and I would like to start to give them the word, and the first one is Katrin Sohet, and then afterwards Thomas Pohl. So I will give you the word, Karin, now. Now you should.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, good. Yeah, it's a question for Katrin. You mentioned several times the need that the developing countries today have a need of liquidity, and this is quite clear, I think. And so you suggested to have a case-by-case, country-by-country approach, and to see how to support them with this. And you said this should be tied to economic reforms. So while I understand that indeed there is probably a need for economic reforms in a number of countries, but I would like to have your opinion about the risk of falling back into the trap of structural adjustment programs, and you know, and using this new form of support to impose some reforms on developing countries. That could be also in the interest of the donor countries, maybe more than the populations in developing countries. There is the whole question of the austerity and so on. And I would like also to know from that point of view, what is your opinion about the fact that from the next generation EU, that the Commission is proposing as a recovery plan. There is this little part that will go to external action, but apart from humanitarian aid, it will mainly be in the form of a guarantee to support investments or to promote investments, and well, in a way to create again more debt. So I would like to get your opinion about how you see this fit with this the urgent need of liquidity at the level of the governments of developing countries, and whether this guarantee fund is the best response, immediate response, as it has to be spent, most part of it has to be spent by or committed by end of 2022, which is quite quick. And so I'm wondering whether this is the right instrument for this.
Okay, thank you for your questions. Of course, there is the risks that industrialized countries will impose reforms in their interest on developing countries. But I have the hope, at least, that developing countries would more participate in designing the reforms and in cooperation with the donors. This should also be, you are right, I should have maybe mentioned this, that one conditions would be also that reforms need to be designed in cooperation with developing countries. I think this is very important that you have mentioned that. But I really hope that we don't have a fallback to the structural adjustment programs and fall back to the austerity programs, and that the donor countries will take on their responsibility in this regard. Regarding your second question, of course, a guarantee fund is not would again enhance the indebtedness of these countries. And maybe there could be a mix of guarantees and grants, but of course there couldn't be only grants given to developing countries. There maybe in some or some instruments could also be guarantees. Of course, it must be discussed which instruments should be guarantees and which instruments should be more grants or highly concessional loans. But of course, it is difficult that, especially for this, the humanitarian aid is of course difficult to have only guarantees here. Yeah.
Thank you. Maxi, would you like to answer the question as well, or should we take the next?
I think we can take the next.
Okay, then the next is Thomas, and I was recognized that I just have to mention the first or the last name because of data protection. So Thomas is the next, and I guess Thomas knows that it's him now. You can speak now.
Yes. Hi everyone. This is Thomas. I assume there might be some Thomases, but I assume since my micro is on now, that isn't in me. So thanks Rasmus for the invitation. Thanks Katrin and thanks Maxi very much for the interesting presentations. I would have a follow-up question to Katrin on the debt relief. So indeed you pointed out that the moratorium that was proposed by the World Bank on the debt relief, or the moratorium on the debt service from the public sector was implemented quite well, was welcomed by many of the donors. But my question would more relate to the private sector. How do you have any ideas how you would coordinate that with the private sector? As I see, that is always a tricky part in the question of debt relief, and not having just private lenders profiting of the debt relief that is provided by the donors. And then the second question maybe to Rasmus. You mentioned the new instrument NDICI and the increase in funding that was not proposed 2 weeks ago. Do you have any insights on your view regarding the European financial lenders? So there was this report from this wise person group to suggest to create a new development bank focused mainly on climate action and sub-Saharan Africa. But I see that there is still quite a lot of discussion going on around that with the EBRD and the EIB. Do you have any thoughts on that? Thanks a lot.
Okay, according to the first question, of course, it will be very difficult to coordinate all creditors, and my prerequisite for the debt relief to include all creditors, be them private or be them public, of course, is yeah, it is could also be a wish, yeah, a wishful thinking, but nevertheless, of course, there are some private institutions, like, well, call them institutions, the London Club, where the private creditors coordinate themselves. This would be one coordination mechanism. Also through the Institute of International Finance in Washington, or the International Capital Market Association in there could be coordination mechanisms. But of course, I see the point, and it will be difficult to include and to also to include all private creditors. Nevertheless, the private creditors in low-income countries are not that important than in middle-income countries or high-income countries. So they are important, especially when it comes also to government bonds, because a lot of low-income countries have recently, or in the previous 5 to 7 years, provided a lot of government bonds, and which were bought by private creditors. But nevertheless, I hope that it would be possible to include as much private creditors as possible. But of course, this would be a problem. Also.
On the other question, basically, we are discussing from the budget side of it. We are discussing the programs and also the figures, and not so much the question on the banks. Maybe some colleagues related to the DEWE committee are more into that, but the main discussions related to the budget and the MFF is, of course, both the size of the programs and how to use the money later on, like the conditionality, and also the question of should it be mainly loans based or grants based. It's a big discussion also related to some of the programs and measures we are doing for Europe, but it's the same kind of arguments and the same kind of debates we can see related to the development financing. And of course, we are close to what Katrin, as Greens, we are close to what Katrin Behrensmann and also Maxi Köhler said. So we would support a grants-based solution much more than a loans-based, also because we really don't think that programs based on loans, mainly based on loans, will help the countries hardest hit because of the complicated economic situation they are in. And when this is true already for some of the countries in Europe, then it's even much more true for countries in different other parts of the world related to their economic situation. But as I understand the discussion, mainly related to the budget committee, is more based on using the bank and instruments we have, like for example the EIB and some banks in the member states, of course. We have a lot of questions in the chat, not so many raised. Other people raised their hand, but I can see that Uwe had raised the hand now, and he asked some of the questions I've got through the question function. So Uwe, I will give you the floor now, then you can ask your questions. Otherwise, I would have read them now, but maybe it's easier if I will give the floor to you. So please, you can talk now.
Thank you very much. I will not ask my question I have written. I will ask a different question.
Okay.
Both experts, thank you very much. Both experts have now mentioned that the liquidity situation in the developing countries is terrible, and it has to be strengthened now. Now the G20 announced a moratorium for 78 countries, and this moratorium is valid till the end of 2020. But as we heard, the economic situation in those countries is terrible. At the end of 2020, I think those countries don't have any chance to pay back even more than now of their debts and interests. And how do you think they can manage the situation in January 21? Because I think the moratorium has to be prolonged for 5 or 10 years. As I see it, it will at least take those countries 10 years to recover so they can pay back. Is there any chance to prolong this moratorium by the G20? And to be honest, the G20 can decide in a different way, but they won't have any chance to get the money because the money is simply not there anymore. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Uwe. And maybe I can add some question from Maren, because it's also related to the debt relief issue. Would you agree with the approach of the open letter? Was co-signed by more than 700 politicians, climatologists, economists, entrepreneurs, students, citizens, and elected representatives at local, national, and European level. And the letter is on the question of debt relief. And then she's mentioning that I signed the letter. So if you're interested in reading it, you can do that on my website, or maybe some of my team can put it in the chat now. But I don't know, Katrin and Maxi, if you know the letter, and if you would like to comment on that, or if it's something you where you have an opinion on, or if not, then I can maybe tell something about it. But maybe Katrin, you can start, and then Maxi, you can add your thoughts.
Okay. According to the first question, I totally agree that the moratorium is too short, that developing countries will not be able to pay it back, and they will probably also, at least a lot of them, will also not be able to pay it back after 5 or 10 years. So that's why I really would prefer debt relief for highly indebted poor countries. The moratorium, or if you look at the moratorium, I think there is a sentence, something like they could prolong the moratorium, but according to my view, it's even not enough to just prolong the moratorium, but because these highly indebted low-income countries will not be able to pay it back also within a few years. So I totally agree with you. And regarding the open letter, really, I don't know it, so I would like not to answer it because I don't know the letter, or I haven't read it.
Okay, I will put it in the chat anyhow. That's fine, but the letter is basically calling for a debt relief for developing countries. It's an initiative from the US, like Bernie Sanders and some others started the initiative, and many colleagues in the European Parliament, me too, signed a letter as a call to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. But I will send the link in the chat, then everybody interested in it can look at it. Maxi.
Yeah, I also totally agree that we need a debt relief, and I'm not so much into detail how the Commission can do that. But I think, yeah, it's important to say that it's necessary and we should be realistic in this case. So yeah, I totally agree.
Okay, thanks. Then we
Sorry, we can't hear you.
financing and the programs.
I'm sorry, we haven't heard you.
Okay, is it better now? Can you hear me?
Yeah, now it works, but about 1 minute or so it didn't.
Okay, I said that we got a question on the rule of law support and conditionality, and if we need some instruments for fighting corruption and the rule and to secure the rule of law related to the development financing instruments. This was one of the questions we've got through the chat. Katrin, would you like to start?
Well, I don't know whether I got it right. So whether the rule of law should be combined with the development instruments, so good governance or so.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Yes, of course. I think that it's very important that good governance and the rule of law is also combined with, and could even be combined with development instruments, and it should also be, or it would be one possibility to also combine it or say that this is a prerequisite for providing debt relief. Yeah.
Okay. Would you like to add to that, Maxi, or should I take another question?
Yeah, you can take another question. I would agree with her. So
we have one question to you from Claudia about the demand of 20% add to human development. Why not quite more, is Claudia asking you. So what's the reason choosing 20%?
Yeah, that's funny, because when we talk to politicians about that, they are always like, why so high? And we're not free in like choosing what projects we're doing. And yeah, 20% is just a realistic amount, because there are so many other projects, but we see that now the EU is not even reaching 20%. So last year it was 5%. No, 2017 it was 5%, and 2018 it was 2.8%. So like you see, 20% is really, really much higher. And yeah, we think that it's realistic to demand that.
Uwe is questioning what the about the proposal from Gerd Müller, Minister Gerd Müller, and because he called for a 50 billion support paid by the European Union and the member states, and he would like to know if this message or proposal from Gerd Müller is something which already is discussed in Brussels, or is it, or if it's just a PR campaign from a German minister. Maybe I can answer that. Of course, we had seen the headlines about that, and of course, this is a good idea. I guess maybe Katrin and Maxi can come with their opinion on that. But at the end, we need to see the member states fighting for that in the council. And so I would answer that he basically is addressing his own chancellor right now and some of the other state leaders, because as it is now, the next step related to the European budget and to the MFF will be the meeting of the council, the 18th of June, and then of course there will be 1 or 2 more in July. And that's what we in the parliament are waiting for. And if this means Müller's statement means that Germany is fighting for this, then of course it would be a step in the right direction, and the European Parliament will strongly support. But at the end, we need to see the council or action in the council now on this question and on so many others, and then the parliament will negotiate afterwards with the member states, and then of course we would support him. I guess that this would be supported by a majority of the MEPs. Would you like to comment on that, Katrin and Maxi, on the thoughts and the statement from Gerd Müller?
No, I don't have any comments, no.
Okay, then Maxi, yeah?
No, I just wanted to say that we worked a lot together with Gerd Müller, and he's really committed, and he really, yeah, I really like his idea, and I really hope that he can, yeah, that his ideas have an influence on the council meeting. So, yeah.
Okay, then we have more questions from Laura Monica. How should the coordination of the system credit risk management process be conducted in central state institutions managing budgetary and monetary policy in order to avoid a financial crisis? Katrin, do you have a comment on that?
Could you say it again? I didn't get it really.
How should the coordination of the system credit risk management process be conducted in central state institutions managing budgetary and monetary policy in order to avoid a financial crisis? So how should the system credit risk management process be coordinated and managed by which institutions and how? This is basically what I got out of the question.
Well, sorry, I don't know really how to answer, but credit risk management of what? Of the public credit risk or private? I mean, this is a bit, I don't really understand the question, I must admit.
How I read the question, but maybe Laura Monica, if you're still in the event, then maybe you can raise your hand, and then I will give you the word, and then maybe you can explain it with your own words. I guess that's much more much easier for us than me interpreting your question. Now she's raising her hand, so I will give you the word now. I think you can speak. Your mic is open, so you. I'm not sure, we can't hear you. Laura? Okay, I will try again. Please try. Okay, I'm sorry we can't hear you. I'm not sure. Maybe you can try with another device or something like that, or with a headset. Okay, we can try again if you have a different device or something, or maybe we can try to get an answer on your question afterwards if it's not possible for you to connect. Then we have a clarification from Thomas, on the G20 moratorium, the number of eligible countries that have applied for the debt relief is very small, potentially because they fear a decreased access to new liquidity in case they use the G20 offer. So that's, I think, an interesting point, because we can see that many questions when it comes to financial instruments, also related to other countries in the European Union, for example, that we need to secure that participating in a moratorium, for example, doesn't mean that it's that you haven't the chance to develop your country, or to be independent on many financial questions. So it's about the criteria that they have to be okay, so that a moratorium in this case mean that you still have more possibilities, like to finance the things you need to finance in your countries, and not to get the situation even more worse than it had been before. And of course, we can also see that in related to some euro discussions we had in the past. And I would say that we should try to make that, or we need to develop that there. And this is a good remark, so that we can maybe try to work on that, and that the G20 or the states related to the G20 from the European Union maybe could try to start some initiatives there. This would be my opinion on the political part of it. But I don't know, Katrin or Maxi, if you would like to add something to the remark from Thomas. Okay. Then I have a question. We have a question from Claudia. A different question. I think with the high amount of money that has to be raised to tackle the global social crisis, we should also think of how to promote tax justice with progressive tax systems and closing the possibilities for tax evasion. This would also increase the ability of developing countries to budget for social programs. Which options do you see in this regard? So question on the tax justice topic. Does some of you would like to say, to react on that, on the tax justice?
Okay. Sorry. Yes, it's true that taxes are important. I think taxes are the most important development the finance resources of developing countries. So it would be important to increase tax justice, for example, to increase the tax base. In addition, of course, it would be important to combat tax evasion. And this, it would be important to enhance tax transparency. And yeah, I think these are very important points, of course. And it would also be, it's also important to mobilize domestic resources rather than taking on more and more external debt.
Yes, and I agree. And if you would implement, for example, some taxes like the financial transaction tax or some other taxes on a global stance, then you could use some of the money also for promoting human aid and development programs. And I think we need to link the debates together, also because some of the some of the taxes or the loopholes in our tax system and through tax evasion are directly affecting also many of the developing countries, and we are not discussing it so close to each other in the European Parliament, for example, but of course there is a link, and at least if we are mobilizing more money from rich people or big companies, digital companies, then we could use and should use the money also for fighting poverty on a global stance, of fighting inequality, but also the climate crisis. So of course we need to link these debates to each other, and we need to see more action on a global stance again, because we need to mobilize it in the OECD at the end, because we know that we can do something in Europe, and we should do more in the European Union also on these taxes, but we all know that we also need to do it globally, and that's where it is linked, I guess, to the debate of debt relief, for example. And we got some more questions also related to where should the money come from, and I think this is basically also a little bit of answer on the question where the money can come from, related to the debt relief topic, but also to raise the spending targets. Then I can see Thomas is raising his hand, so I will give you the word again. Now you can speak.
Thanks, Rasmus. Yes, maybe to take the discussion from the short-term debt relief to the more long-term perspectives, as Katrin has also provided us some input in the presentation. So let's assume, like Maxi said, we increase the available budget further, and as mentioned, quality is very important as well, besides the amount of money. Do you have any ideas how maybe we can be more efficient in implementing these funds? If you look at Europe, there are at the moment quite a lot of institutions. Rasmus, you mentioned the national development banks, and then we have, of course, the European Union, but then also every country has some shareholding in, let's say, the multilateral banks. Do you have any insights, maybe what would you change in order to make that more efficient? Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, we can't hear you.
Yeah, but now, I think some of the questions are linked. All right, now the most important fight right now I can see is that we need to get much programs, much stronger programs than we are having them now. So the first target would be to also campaign on that, and to raise awareness of that, because if you're looking on the numbers or the figures related to the European budget, then you can see that of course there is some of the programs are being raised. We've already talked about that, but at the end, when it comes to the overall amount, then related to the huge raise in other programs, we can see that it's still just a very small figure that will be spent on humanitarian aid and development financing, development programs, and that's why I think especially in the upcoming weeks, you need to find allies for fighting this, for getting some member states really interested in fighting this fight in the European Council, and then you need to have this on board when the European Parliament, me and my colleagues, we are 6 from the European Parliament responsible for the overall amounts, the overall MFF, and then of course some colleagues from the committees are negotiating the details in the programs, and there we need to be active, and that's why I think we need some campaign work there in the next weeks and months, because this is basically the overall discussion. How much money it will be spent will be in the next weeks, and then afterwards you will have the details in the programs, and of course there you also need to raise some of the debates you were referring to. But on the political stage related to the work in the European Parliament and in the other institutions, I guess this should be the thing or the questions we need to concentrate on now. And related to that, I can see that Uwe is asking, it's a question he asked, was one of the first questions we received. I would like to know how the European Parliament discusses the 15.6 billion the Commission wants to contribute to the Corona hidden countries, but that money comes from the DEVE budget. Could we say, so the development budget, could we say that the development countries pay their own support, because it's not really an increase, but it's something where maybe other programs will be used? And of course this is true. We will get some additional money for the heading, like Maxi mentioned in the beginning of our event, but at the end we are not we haven't full transparency of how what the money will be spent on. So we really don't know if it's more on development programs, on what kinds of programs, and or to some other elements related to that. And of course it could be also end up with using the money in a bad way, so that not the things we would like to see supported will be supported at the end. And of course, if this means that we will not get more money to the development budget, but just are getting are using money from different programs, development programs or other development programs, then of course the problem is much bigger, and nothing will be solved. So of course we should be aware of that, and this is also something where I think NGOs and experts need to focus on, and also to raise an awareness about that this could happen, because this is something, yeah, which could make we could end up with, because at the end then the message would be we had raised one program and everybody thinks this is good, but then nobody sees the decrease in other programs. But I don't know, Katrin, would you like to comment on that? I guess you would support that, and you wouldn't, and you are aware of that. No, that it wouldn't be good that we are using some of the programs for financing the others.
Yes, of course, I agree. Yes, yeah. But I don't have more to say here.
Okay, Maxi, would you like to add a comment to it?
I'd just like to say that we will raise awareness for that topic, and we'll hope that the EU will be transparent with this thing. I didn't know that. But also in Germany, we had this case some years ago, so it's not something untypical, I would say. So yeah, we will have an eye on that.
Okay, thanks. The next one is Karine, and I will give you the floor now. Please.
Okay, thanks. It's me again. Now, regarding that question about which kind of program will be supported and where will the money go, it is indeed quite unclear for the moment how this additional funding that is now allocated to the external action will be used. But what is a bit worrying from my point of view is the fact that with this additional funding for the guarantee fund, there is also the proposal to double the target for the leveraging of investment, so to 130 billion. So it's a very ambitious target that the EU would set itself, and then the risk is that everything will go in that direction, that everything will be made possible to reach the target. When you put such a high target in a regulation, then it's a binding target because it is in the regulation, and so there is a risk that the quality or the criteria will be downgraded to make sure that the target is reached. So I think it is a bit dangerous to put a target. I think I would prefer that they keep a lower target and they might go beyond. They might say it should be a minimum, and because we don't know how this will function yet. We don't have the sufficient evidence from the existing guarantee fund, EFSD, about the impact it has, about how it is functioning. So it is a bit hazardous now to put such a high target. And then in that case, the 10.5 billion, we could say, yeah, it goes in the guarantee fund. And then it can also maybe free some money for other types of support, for other modalities in the NDICI instrument, for budget support, for supporting civil society, for supporting sectoral budget support or specific programs, if it appears that this is what is needed, or it appears that it is what is more effective. So I think that there should be more more opening, maybe more, looking a bit at what is happening now with the immediate response package that is quite big as well. This package that was adopted by Team Europe, and see how it functions, whether it responds to the needs and so on, and then to readjust maybe for the future. But I think it's a bit so. And there, I just say it now because we are with you, Rasmus, and members of the Parliament. So this is part of the NDICI regulation. So the Parliament has a say on this very ambitious target, and it is possible maybe to rectify that. So thank you.
Thank you, Karine. We are at the end of our discussion, so I would like to give you the floor one more time, Katrin and Maxi, for some final statements. And I would like to ask you the question, and then maybe you can comment on what Karine said, but what kind of what do you think the European Parliament in the next weeks should concentrate on in the fight for a strong development financing programs? So we will have some hard discussions, some hard negotiations on the European budget, on many questions related to that, and at the end we also need to concentrate on some key messages and some key questions where we need to really fight for. And I would like to start out with asking you, what do you think the European Parliament and the MEPs should concentrate on in the fight? What's the most important point in your view related to the questions we had discussed in the last 90 minutes? I don't know, Maxi, would you like to start, and Katrin can conclude?
Yeah, so thank you again for this debate and for committing so much about this topic. In my opinion, I think that the European Parliament and the MEPs should really concentrate on a strong MFF which must be a turning point, as I already said. And we need we need more money for heading 6, obviously. And besides of that, I think it's always great when MEPs raise awareness for the topic of development aid and extreme poverty and all these things, because it's so important, and it's something that it's not on the daily news, but it's happening every day, and we have the opportunity and the responsibility to change something. And so thank you again for this event, Rasmus, and all the things you're doing. Yeah.
Thanks, Maxi. Katrin.
I think it is important that the instruments the Europe has would need to be flexible, and that they could be used immediately, because in such exogenous shocks like the coronavirus, we need money immediately, and also maybe for some countries at least on a large amount. And we need to allocate the money for the right countries. There should always be a case-by-case analysis. In addition, one thing is important, that we need to support the green transformation, that we need to support, as I said, a kind of green Marshall Plan and not just a Marshall Plan.
Okay, thanks for that. Thanks, Maxi. Thanks, Katrin, for contributing. Thanks to all of you participating. We as Greens are hardly fighting for it together with colleagues in the European Parliament, so that we will see a further increase of the development instruments in the European budget in the upcoming weeks, if the Commission is taking their own headline serious, then we need to see a further increase there, because at least the von der Leyen Commission had said that global responsibility and the role of Europe as a global leader in the world will be one of the priorities they have set, and that means also a lot for the developing programs. And of course, we also need to see movement on the side of the Council, so pressure from NGOs, both in Brussels, related to the upcoming meetings of the European Council, but also in the member states, in the capital cities like Berlin, and others would help a lot. And then, of course, we need to see an increase. We need to see more transparency in the program, so that we can look on them and see what kind of projects the money will be spent on. And we need some strong priorities, and I really believe that this is key, because people are accepting more money for these kind of programs when they can see what the money will be spent on. And of course, the climate crisis, but also the extreme poverty in many parts of the world are especially important, and we need to build some strong alliances to fight that, and we need to do that globally. And of course, also the question of the debt relief. This is something Europe can't do alone, but where we need global institutions on it, but also there we need to see more action. And I think we need and we should go further with that. And the event we had tonight is maybe one contribution to this, and then I think we should try to develop on that and stay in contact, and then hopefully after the negotiations on the European budget we can say that we had reached some of the goals we've set tonight. That would at least be what I am hoping for. So I would say thank you to all of you, and have a nice evening. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.